Good day, everyone. Thank you for joining us in another serving of Guardians of the Constitution. Today, we certainly have the distinct honor and pleasure of speaking to the son of Jamaica's first post-independence Speaker of the House of Representatives, and that is our 8th Prime Minister, Mr. Bruce Golding. Mr. Bruce Golding, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here.
Thank you. We're going to have a discussion today about the role of the Office of the Prime Minister, one that you served in from 2007 to 2011. And not necessarily about your tenure, but because you've served in the role, I'd like to have a conversation about how you see the role, drawing on your experience, and how you see it in terms of the practicalities and also the constitutional theories that goes with the office. Perhaps the best place to start is if we acknowledge that, yes, it is the Governor General who, if you like, appoints the Prime Minister. But one of the things that puzzles me is the issue of the sources and the source of the power of the Prime Minister. We look through the Constitution, there are lots of sections where the Prime Minister appoints or advises, or the other way around, makes recommendation. From your experience, would you agree with me when I say, in terms of the Prime Minister's power, it's a mixture of numbers in the House of Representatives and personality?
Well, in a sense, yes. But you need to bear in mind that we operate under the Westminster parliamentary system, in which there's a head of state who happens to be the Queen of England, who is represented in Jamaica by the Governor General. What is interesting is that the Governor General is normally appointed by the Queen on the recommendation of the Prime Minister. So even though the Constitution makes the Prime Minister secondary to the Governor General, the representative of the head of state, the effective power, executive power, really lies in the hands of the Prime Minister. The Constitution, for example, requires that the Governor General, except in some very limited instances, the Governor General is obliged to accept and to act on the advice of the Prime Minister. So the Prime Minister is the chief executive officer of the government. The Prime Minister is dependent on, of course, on the confidence of a majority of the members of Parliament. The Prime Minister is not directly elected, even though, and you have seen elections in Jamaica, even though when voters go to the polls, uppermost in their mind is who would become Prime Minister. When they go to the polling station, the Prime Minister, the person that they expect to be Prime Minister, or the person who others hope would be Prime Minister, their names are not on that ballot. The names on that ballot are the representatives for that particular location, that particular constituency. What uppermost in their mind is not who is going to represent me in this constituency, but who do I want as Prime Minister? And in order to have that person chosen as Prime Minister, I have to elect somebody who would be part of that majority, whose inclination as to who they would support, which is conveyed to the Governor General, would be in favor of the person that I want to be Prime Minister. So in a sense, our elections have a very heavy presidential tone,
yes,
in terms of how people express themselves. But we still operate under the Westminster system, where the Prime Minister is really a creature of the Parliament.
But even though he or she is, and has always been, the creature of Parliament, if you like, from your experience, certainly in the 1980s when you served under Mr. Edward Seaga, who most historians say had a dominant personality, if you like, was the role of the Prime Minister, certainly as practiced by Mr. Seaga for the years that he was Prime Minister, was his personality, if you like, one that shaped the office?
Uh, to some extent, yes. I mean, I believe that every holder of the office does have some impact in terms of how the office evolves, because it's constantly evolving over time. Mr. Siaga was a very strong leader, very strong personality, as you indicated, and naturally, his own style of leadership would have impacted how he operated as prime minister. He was a micromanager. He took onto himself a large chunk of the decision making of government. But he still presided over a cabinet where members of the cabinet, and I was one, were able to perform their own roles as ministers of government under his guidance. One of the things that you need to bear in mind is that the prime minister also happens to be a party leader.
Yes.
And very often his or her functioning as party leader becomes intertwined with their performance as prime minister. And that is almost unavoidable, because if you don't maintain the unity of your party, through which the parliamentarians express their confidence in you as prime minister, then your tenure as prime minister could be rather short, couldn't it?
Certainly. And it leads me to the question of this issue of the office of the prime minister. Now, in our constitution, the only place where we see a reference being made to the office of the prime minister as a body corporate, if you like, and it doesn't say it is I think it's section 71, where it talks about how one can resign and can be removed from the office.
Yes.
I asked this question, are we now at this stage where we should create, if you like, the office of the prime minister in a sense comparative to what obtains in the American system, because we do not have that office as yet?
And perhaps in doing so, you're seeking to make a sharper distinction between the office itself and the person who at a particular time may occupy the office. It is something that's worth considering. Mind you, I would be somewhat hesitant to disrupt the constitutional arrangement purely to do that. In other words, as Dr. Lloyd Barnett would say, it is so intertwined with other critical provisions of the Constitution that if you start tinkering with one piece of it, you affect the effectiveness of other critical sections. So it's something that I think would need to be taken into consideration.
Even if we tinker and we have to upset, and perhaps the next 70 or 100 years, should we consider, is it worth considering a sort of one principal document in which, or a section within the Constitution in which all the functions and the roles of the prime minister is clearly stated, so that we move from the sort of discretionary powers that obtains in our Constitution? Would that be a recipe for too much of a straitjacket approach, and thereby ignoring the realities, the political realities of being prime minister?
I don't like looking at these things purely theoretically.
Yes.
I believe we have to look at them as well, based on our experience, how it has worked. You know, they say if something ain't broke, no bother to repair it. The prime minister functions essentially at the pleasure of the majority in parliament. Now, parliament is really the place where the party representatives sit, those who have been elected to parliament.
Yes.
So the prime minister really, even though he is beholden to parliament, the prime minister owes his position essentially to his party, to the voters who elected his party in the majority.
Yes, in real terms, yes.
And I think one has to be careful that one doesn't ring the office of the position of prime minister so tightly that you end up with situations that require action, but that action can't be taken because the prime minister's powers are so circumscribed. Look at the US situation, and I was once very enamored with the US political system. I'm no longer.
Mm-hmm.
I think the experience of the last
4 or 5 years,
4 or 5 years, and perhaps even more, has demonstrated that this system, when it works, it can work well, but when it screws up badly. Poor President Biden is struggling to deliver on the mandate that the people gave him. He campaigned with clear commitment to do certain things. And he's now faced with a situation where the legislative body, because his powers are so heavily circumscribed, this legislative body is saying, well, we don't care whether you won by 8 million votes. We don't care that this is a commitment that you gave to the people and on the basis of which the people elected you. We're not going to allow you to do it. That, I think, is a recipe for disaster. I mean, that is standing still. And I would be reluctant to do anything that could have that kind of effect. The prime minister right now, his powers are limited, as you know, in several respects. The prime minister can't appoint judges. He can't fire judges. He can't fire the director of public prosecutions. He can't direct how elections are to be administered. One of the things that we have done, and a lot of the credit for that is due to Mr. Siaga and Michael Manley. We started with the electoral system, where we lifted it out of the combative arena of party politics, and we placed it in the hands of independent persons, still having the input of the political parties, but with the control being put in the hands of independent persons. Yeah. We have done that with several other critical areas of national life, where we felt it was important to separate these from this kind of self-serving interest that politicians sometimes become captive to. And it has worked very well. I mean, I think it's the model that a number of other countries that I've been to have actually copied what we have done in some of these instances. So I'm just suggesting that we don't exaggerate the powers of the prime minister, because they are in fact, limited in some important respects.
But one place in which the powers of the prime minister is unmistakably clear is certainly in terms of his presence or her presence in the cabinet.
Yeah.
The prime minister is not necessarily first among equals in the cabinet. The prime minister, would you agree, is now the supreme person in cabinet? Do we agree on that?
I agree on that, but a lot too depends on how the prime minister becomes the prime minister. For example, it has never happened in my experience where a majority in the cabinet seek to overrule the prime minister.
Mm-hmm.
We have discussions, robust discussions. Sometimes we are able to get the prime minister to go and rethink a particular position that he may have put forward. Sometimes the prime minister insists, no, this is how I want it to be done. Remember, the prime minister can dismiss his cabinet members. So yes, if you're sitting at a table and you know the Prime Minister can send a letter to the Governor General to dismiss you, your inclination to be obstructive is very limited, is tempered. And that essentially, the people of Jamaica don't want the Prime Minister to say to them, now the reason why I haven't been able to do these things is that the other members of the cabinet overruled me. People didn't go to the polling station electing a cabinet. They went to the polling station intending who should be the Prime Minister. Albeit they were doing so through a proxy, their member of parliament.
Yes.
And I think you have to be careful that you don't do things that says, well, all right, the people wanted you to be the Prime Minister, to be the head of the government, to lead the government, to direct the government. You're having done that. Let us clearly understand that we're not going to allow the Prime Minister to do what he wants. We are going to take over the role that you, in fact, had given to the Prime Minister when you voted.
Yes.
I keep stressing this, because democracy must ultimately reflect the will of the people. And the will of the people was not for decisions to be taken by Robert Montague or Horace Chang. The will of the people was for decisions to be taken primarily by Andrew Holness. And therefore, we have to be careful that we don't frustrate that express will of the people.
This is true. However, some will argue that there can be those times when there are matters of principles, and because of the nature and the power of the nature of the role of the Prime Minister and the power that the Prime Minister has, he or she, we have to guard against those instances where issues of principles, be it in the context of human rights or even on economic policies, a Prime Minister wants to go off on a frolic that is going to be destructive.
I take your point. Yeah. But bear in mind, a Prime Minister who is smart knows that you have to have a happy cabinet around you. You're playing with serious fire. If you have a cabinet that is in which a lot of people are grumbling, they're not happy, they don't agree, but maybe they are brave enough to say so because they will say so elsewhere.
Yes.
And we have seen experiences where a cabinet that is not cohesive can undermine a government. So again, we have to be careful that we don't over-prescribe.
Yes.
Prime ministers know that they have to. I was there. There are matters that I consulted with outside of cabinet with my senior leaders, like the deputy prime minister. There are matters that I would lay out in cabinet and say, look, we're not taking a decision on this today. We have some time. We're going to come back to it in 2 weeks' time. I want members to give it serious thought and go and take such advice, consult with whoever you feel, so that you get a full sense of the impact that this is likely to have. But in 2 weeks' time, we're going to sit down and we're going to come to a decision. That system has worked. And if it has worked, I'm a little reluctant to go and put in a system that may not work.
Yes. And what's the role, again, I'm drawing on your experience during the 80s and also when you were prime minister. Firstly, when you were a minister in the 80s, was there ever a kitchen cabinet?
Yes, but I have to be careful how we define it. On matters that were highly political, the prime minister would consult with a few of us. I was general secretary of the party for half of that period, and I was chairman for the other half. So it would be myself and deputy leaders and so on. If it's a matter that had serious political implications, broader national issues, the prime minister would consult with those who we felt that particular matter impacted most. I mean, if it was the foreign policy issue, it would be the foreign minister, it may be the Minister of Industry and Commerce and so on. And then the matter would come to the full cabinet, but it would have benefited from the input of those persons who the Prime Minister felt he needed to consult. I did the same thing. You know, in the gamut of issues that come across your desk that may need cabinet input, you don't call a cabinet meeting to discuss every one of them. I mean, there are things that you discuss with individual ministers because it is a matter that affects their portfolio. It's a matter that they may have particular experience in dealing with.
And on that note, ladies and gentlemen, we'll take a break and return shortly. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for staying with us. Now, Mr. Golding, yes, you say the kitchen cabinet certainly exists in the sense of the persons will be consulted by different prime ministers on specific issues. The role of the Parliament cabinet subcommittees or committees, not much is known of them or about them, but what's their role for the benefit of
critical? That's critical. There are several subcommittees, and the primary purpose of these subcommittees, most of them, is to deal with matters that will go to cabinet or matters that have been to cabinet and have been referred to the committees for more detailed study. This is where they call in the technocrats, they call in people from civil society, they call in affected. I mean, if you're dealing with a matter that affects agriculture, you may want to have discussions with representatives of the Jamaica Agricultural Society. It would be difficult to do that at a full cabinet level. So you have these subcommittees. They go through every cabinet issue. Some of it may involve legislation, some of it may involve cabinet policy. They go through each of those with a fine-tooth comb, determining what the impact is likely to be, what inputs are necessary before a final decision is made by cabinet. And they report back to cabinet with their recommendations. Ultimately, the decision is for cabinet to make. But they're absolutely critical. They do a lot of work. And the more work they do, or the more they are allowed to work, is the more structured cabinet meetings can become. I've had situations where a cabinet meeting lasts 8-10 hours. Depending on the issues that we're dealing with. I mean, if you're putting together a budget, for example, and you have a hole in the budget that has to be closed, you may spend hours looking at different ways of closing that budget hole. But I've had situations too where a cabinet meeting would last 2 hours, simply because so much valuable work has been done by the cabinet subcommittees that when the matter comes before us, it doesn't require extensive debate and discussion. You know, it's pretty straightforward, and decision can be made very quickly.
Good. Thank you very much for that. Now, we touched on the office of the Prime Minister earlier. One of the practices, certainly, I've noticed in this current administration that we have is, and I'm not suggesting that it is peculiar to this administration, but the practice of, if you like, getting ministers and placing them within the office of the Prime Minister. Now, how undermining is that, if at all, and is it something that we should discourage?
I think in this particular instance, I think Prime Minister Holness felt that the urgencies that faced him when he came to office required two things. One, required that critical sections of government be hooked up to each other, to ensure smoother policy making, smoother policy implementation. And secondly, I think he felt that as the Prime Minister, these were areas that required his direct oversight. It is not, in my view, a situation that should become permanent. it's a different style from previous prime ministers. For example, and I was never part of the cabinet, but I was a student of politics in those days. Sir Alexander Bustamante had a completely different approach. He selected what he considered to be the best people to run the government, and they appointed them as members of the cabinet. If you look back at the cabinet of 1962, it was an amazing cabinet in terms of the depth of talent that was there. You know, the Robert Lightman, Edward Seaga, Clem Tavares, you name them. And he reserved himself. He's the captain of the team. He's not the star batsman. He's not the star bowler. Matter of fact, he was prepared to captain the team from the benches. Mm-hmm. And he would intervene when he felt that his intervention was necessary. He felt that his primary job was to be the face of the government in dealing with the people. That's a completely different style. I mean, over time, we saw some of it during Mr. Seaga's time, during Mr. Patterson's time, where, and times have changed. You know, the complexities of government are much greater today than they were 50, 60 years ago. But I think there's a danger of over-concentration. And there's a danger too of duplication, where you find agencies are sort of tripping over each other. I think eventually it's a much better situation to have the functions of the different ministries clearly defined, separated. You can reduce the number of ministries, but I think it may be unwise on a long-term basis to have the over-concentration of portfolios.
Yes. And on that issue of portfolios, Sir Donald Sangster would have been Sir Alexander Bustamante's deputy for a long time, but more importantly, certainly in the last 3 to 4 years of Mr. Bustamante's tenure as Prime Minister, effectively, Mr. Sangster, based on my research, tells me that he was the Prime Minister, the acting Prime Minister.
Yes, because Sir Alexander was not well.
Yes.
Sir Alexander had suffered a series of strokes in 1964, and Donald Sangster effectively, as acting Prime Minister, he was in charge of the government.
As provided by the Constitution.
Yes.
The second thing in our Constitution is the role of the Deputy Prime Minister. And I am concerned.
Except that the Constitution does not even recognize that.
Yes. And so I'm asking this question, given certainly when you resigned, that issue was settled amicably. There was a coronation, if you like. So we didn't have a situation that was solved politically, but rather it was solved in a simple way. Should we therefore contemplate for the next 50 to 60 years, given our experience, one, to formalize, put it on a constitutional footing, the role of the Deputy Prime Minister, because of the complexities of government, and so that we can have a seamless transition in the event that a Prime Minister falls ill, no prospects of recovery, or in the event a Prime Minister has to or chooses to resign. Shouldn't we now have formally a constitutional role of Deputy Prime Minister?
Well, yes and no. Yes, I believe that the position of Deputy Prime Minister ought to be formalized and ought to be recognized in the Constitution. But beyond that, I believe that the Deputy Prime Minister should be somebody who is chosen by the Prime Minister. Yes. I believe a Prime Minister should be given the right to select who his deputy ought to be. Yes. I believe that the functions and duties of the Deputy Prime Minister should be left for the Prime Minister to decide. He may want to assign functions based on the particular aptitude, particular influence position of an individual. And finally, unlike the United States, where the president is elected on the same ticket as the vice president, or vice versa, rather. I would not support any automatic succession of a deputy prime minister.
Why not?
If the prime minister were to resign. I believe that we should revert to how the prime minister was appointed in the first place, which is for the governor general to act on the basis of the views of the majority of members of parliament. And this is especially so if the deputy prime minister is to be appointed by the prime minister himself. You don't want the prime minister to be tying up not just his own tenure, but the tenure that would be there after he has left, or after he has passed away.
Understood. I mean, in terms of the deputy prime minister that we have from memory, did Mr. Siaga have a deputy prime minister?
Yes, Mr. Shearer.
Sure, yes. Sorry about that. We have not had any dominant, if you like, deputy prime ministers. If in fact we've had very silent ones.
No, I would disagree. PJ Patterson was deputy prime minister to Michael Manley for a long time. He was quite assertive. So too, I think, was Mr. Shearer. So too, I think, was David Core. So I think that Ken Bo in my time. But deputy prime ministers normally are very careful and sensitive, not to try to overshadow, not to try to steal the limelight from the prime minister. It's a natural thing. He's my boss. So let me not step in front of him.
Now, our constitution says that the prime minister should effectively keep the governor general informed of the general direction of government.
Yes.
Is this something that takes place, and how often? How is that achieved?
I can speak of my time. I had monthly meetings with the governor general. I would call on the governor general every month on a scheduled basis, and more frequently if a particular issue arose that I thought it was important for me to advise him on the matter. I assume that is how it is being done now. I remember as well during the time of the late Howard Cook as Governor General, he took it a step further. He instituted a system where the Governor General would also consult with the leader of the opposition on a scheduled basis. In the time I was leader of the opposition, it was every month. And that's useful. I think the Governor General ought to be, even though he is not a part of the executive, I believe it's important for the Governor General to be aware and kept abreast of developments that are taking place.
Ever had any disagreements with the Governor General in terms of appointments, or have you heard of any? Or you would not?
There have been some issues in the past. There was a major issue, I know, when Sir Flores Glasspool was Governor General, in the appointment of the local Privy Council, where the then Prime Minister, Mr. Manley, had made a recommendation, and Sir Florizel would have none of it. And Sir Florizel insisted that the appointment of the Privy Council is not on one of those on which he must act on the advice of the Prime Minister. It's one in which he exercises his own discretion. And he was right. And there have been some others, but none of any major. I mean, for example, in the appointment of, say, the Electoral Commission, the Governor General will consult with the Prime Minister and the leader of the opposition. He will put forward names. The Prime Minister or the leader of the opposition may very well say, look, I'm not happy with this particular name. And the Governor General will consider and may withdraw that name and substitute another. Or he may seek to persuade, or he may insist that, look, I'm going to make this appointment. I've consulted you. I've taken note of your concerns. It's a process of consultation and dialogue. But there have been disagreements, yes. None that has resulted in government being dysfunctional, with the exception of that long period when the Privy Council was not properly constituted.
And you've seen the operation of the politics in our country for a long time. You've been part of it. You've been one of the players. How has the role of the Prime Minister changed in your view from, say, 1962 to present day? How has it changed?
Much more, it has become much more administrative. The Prime Minister is much more involved in decision making. A lot of decisions that in the past were made by bureaucrats are now, over time, have been the responsibility of political representatives, the cabinet, the Prime Minister, because ultimately they're the ones that bear the responsibility. They're the ones when things don't go right. People are not calling for the head of some permanent secretary somewhere or some chairman of some board somewhere. They're calling for the head of the Prime Minister. And this places additional burden on the Prime Minister's position, so that a lot of administrative work is now sitting on his desk.
Interesting. And have you ever, during your tenure, wondered, why did I take this job?
No, you can't devote your life to a particular pursuit and then ask yourself foolish questions like that. What you do is that you ask God to give you wisdom and strength so that you can perform as best as you can.
Okay. And you have never had a situation where you're sitting on the opposition bench and you said to yourself, good God, he's doing a damn good job.
Yes. Yes.
It is?
Yes. There have been, during the time of Mr. Manley, despite the many things that he did with which I disagreed, there were some very positive things that he did in terms of uplifting the masses, in terms of removing some of the systemic prejudices that were, and I say systemic because they were coded into our law. Mr. Patterson, I think, did some very significant things, and I have actually in the House acknowledged it, even though I may criticize them on other points. But yes. That's it. One of the good things about Jamaica, you see, and I say that looking now at what has transpired in so many other parts of the world, and right now at the United States, we have had universal adult suffrage in Jamaica since 1944. That's 77 years. We have had a peaceful transition of power, peaceful transfer of power on 8 occasions. Even when there were disputes about the way in which the electoral system had operated. I mean, like, for example, the 1976 election, and it was a struggle in relation to what transpired in those elections that eventually led to the major program of electoral reform. But no matter what the issues were, one party, if the voters said, look, we want the other set of guys to take over, there was a peaceful transition. You look at what is happening in America now, as a contrast to that. We're not perfect, but there's so much that we have to be proud of, that we have developed over these many years. Our constitutional arrangements are things that must be kept under constant review. We have had a constitution that was launched at the time of independence in 1962. That's what, 60, almost 60 years ago. We have had some changes done to it. I was very proud that one of the major changes, the question of establishing the Charter of Fundamental Rights, I wasn't responsible for all the work. I mean, a lot of work was done by my predecessor, but I was proud to have been the one to have taken that amending bill to Parliament. And there are still other areas that we need to look at. But generally speaking, I could never join any chorus that seeks to blame our lack of progress where we have not progressed as much as we should have on our Constitution. I believe that our Constitution has served us well, but anything that was created 60 years ago may need to be fine-tuned, may need major overhaul, and that's something that we must constantly keep in focus. We did arrive at agreement going back to 1995. That's 20 years ago, almost. More than 20 years ago. We did arrive at agreement on some significant constitutional reform measures. And I'm disappointed that we have not implemented them, largely because a lot of those changes require a referendum, which is a pretty tedious process that you have to go through. But in addition to that, there were some issues that we couldn't agree on. And for some reason, the political parties have not been able to agree that, well, let us proceed with the ones that we agree on while we work on the others, because the opposition parties have the view that if they were to do that, then there will be no appetite or no anxiety to deal with the outstanding ones. So the whole thing hangs together. But I do feel that we have a good constitutional structure, need to improve on some areas of it. I think the Charter of Fundamental Rights was an important departure from what was there before, because it now made fundamental rights justiciable, which it was not before. Prior to that, any right that the Constitution gave you as a citizen, the government could undermine it if it considered that it was necessary in the interest of public order, public safety, public morality. God knows who is to define that. But now it's a situation where not only are they specified, but the courts can intervene if those rights are violated.
But on that note, as Prime Minister during your tenure, or even when Mr. Siaga or Mr. Mangus, did you form the view that the Prime Minister or US Prime Minister or the other Prime Ministers saw themselves as guardians of the Constitution?
I don't know that they are to be seen as guardians of the Constitution, because the Constitution seeks to put rings around their own power and authority. There have been issues where prime ministers have stepped out of line. For example, when an attempt was made to abolish the right of appeal to the Judicial Committee of the British Privy Council, the prime minister at the time was convinced that this was in keeping with government policy, this was in keeping with the mandate that the government had sought and got from the people. There were many voices, including the opposition then, including many people from the legal community, who said to him, no, you're stepping out of line. You are going beyond what the Constitution allows. So I think it would be better to say that the prime ministers have, by and large, respected the Constitution. But I believe that we would be overstating it if we were to go so far as say that they saw themselves as guardians of the Constitution. I think on a number of occasions, prime ministers kind of leaned on the ropes a bit. For example, the state of emergency in 1976 was a major violation of people's rights. I could never say that Mr. Manley was acting as a guardian of the Constitution when that was imposed, when candidates of the opposing political party were arrested. People like Colonel Charles spent 9 months in detention. So no.
I mean, I
would say that generally speaking, they have respected the Constitution.
Yeah, and I asked,
but some of them have, on instances, tested the Constitution.
Like yourself.
Well, in what regard?
Well, when we look at the position you took in Mr. Coke's case, I seem to recall you saying, well, rights don't stop at the halfway tree, something of the sort.
Yeah, but I was using tested as putting to the test. No.
Okay. But in that particular instance, some would say you were being a guardian of a constitutional right that you thought the citizen must be accorded.
I felt then. There are a number of errors that I made in that matter, but I felt then, and I still feel to this day, that we were being taken advantage of.
Okay.
That our constitutional and not just our constitution, but our legal processes were also being violated. And I felt strongly about it, and the fact that it was being done by the mighty United States of America only made me more incensed, because I felt that we were being bullied by a mighty power who was able to mobilize significant public support in Jamaica. The U.S. embassy at that time was very busy networking here in Jamaica and mobilizing a crescendo of views, which eventually won out. But I believe that one day we're going to appreciate that we were wronged in that instance.
Yes, understood. Well, Mr. Golding, I appreciate the time that you've taken, and I personally have enjoyed this conversation. You've said some things that have challenged even my thoughts on aspects of our Constitution, and I like that toing and froing on ideas. It means that there'll be hope and there'll be actual progress. Ladies and gentlemen, just join me to thank Mr. Golding, not only for his participation in the series, but also for his service to our country. And I'm of the view that still one of the better prime ministers that we didn't get a chance to see in a second term.
Oh, you're so kind. Thank you very much. I really enjoyed this. Thank you.